and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Kay Erickson with the League of Women Voters of South Tonka, and today we're going to be talking about protecting pollinators. Pollinators are those animals, including insects and bees and birds, that transfer pollen among flowering plants. Together they account for the reproduction of 90% of the flowering plants across the globe. Pollinators contribute over $24 billion to the U.S. economy, but they're important in many other ways as well. However, in the last decade or so, the number of pollinators has been declining, and bees especially have been hard hit. They're dying by millions all over the world. Today I'm talking with two activists to explore why we need bees and other pollinators, why they're dying off, and what we can do to protect them. Patricia Hauser is a member of LWV South Tonka. She, with her husband, Jeff Densmore, co-founded a local organization called Humming for Bees. Her husband is also a beekeeper in Shorewood. Lex Horan is an organizer with the Pesticide Action Network, or PAN. He's worked extensively on pollinator issues across Minnesota, and he's currently serving on Governor Dayton's Committee on Pollinator Protection. So Lex and Patricia, let's start with what pollinators do, but first let's explain how exactly pollination works.
Sure, that's a great question. So pollinators are any insect, bird, or other creature that visits plants to collect pollen and nectar for their own nutrition. And when they collect that pollen and nectar, they take a little bit of pollen along with them. So when they visit the next flower, that pollen stays there. And that enables pollen to transfer between flowers so that they can reproduce and grow.
So are you saying that without pollination we don't get seeds and crops, basically?
Yeah, that's right. Many of the foods that so many of us love, and in fact that are growing in many of our gardens right now, rely on pollination. And so, of course, some delicious foods like almonds, coffee, chocolate, but also things that are growing here in Minnesota right now: squash, zucchini, melons, many herbs, things like that. And so without pollinators, 1 in 3 bites of food that we eat, including many very nutritious foods, would be missing from our diets.
Okay, so let's talk a little more about bees and why they're so important to that process.
Bees and all pollinators, because it's not just bees that do the pollinating, are really important. First, because they're part of the balance of nature. And we know what happens when something gets out of balance. If a predator is gone, like right now in our garden, we have we have turkeys and rabbits and deer running through our yard out here in the suburbs, and it's missing the predator. So there's that. Also, plants produce food for humans and animals, pollinated plants, and along with other pollinators, bees and other pollinators, as we mentioned, give us 1/3 of our food. So there's over 90 different crops that are grown in the U.S. alone that depend on pollination. And the other neat thing about pollinators is their services are free. They go around because, as Lex was saying, they need food for themselves and their brood. And now some facts, I also want to mention some facts about bees. Not all bees are black and yellow. Not all bees sting. Not all bees make honey. And actually, there are about 20,000 different species of bees worldwide.
Oh my goodness.
20,000, and honeybees are only one of those species.
Oh my, wow.
So it kind of puts it in perspective.
Yeah.
We have, the other are called native bees. There are about 400 in Minnesota. There's 400, sometimes I've heard 425, 450 different species of native bees. Bumblebee is one of the native bees. And I just want to mention too, while I'm talking about native bees, there's such a thing as native plants. That means plants that are indigenous to Minnesota. They can live and grow in our soil and climate. And the neat thing about these native plants, they're good for both honeybees and native bees. And I want to mention, honeybees were imported from with the colonists when they came over, 200 years ago plus. They wanted the honey, and they wanted their pollination services, and they wanted to plant some of the crops from the old country. So they also brought their bees along, honeybees. With native plants, they have really, really long roots on the whole. And there's a slide that you can see a little on the left-hand corner of the slide, a little tuft of grass in their roots, and then you see the native plants in their roots. And the important thing about this is that in times of drought, they can still get moisture. In times of great moisture, they keep the soil intact and steady and hold it in place. So they're really, really great. And they feed both honeybees and native bees, as I mentioned, so they're really cool to have.
And native bees are important because we don't only have bees that pollinate agricultural crops, they're in the woods pollinating, I assume, berries and other things that other animals eat, like bears, and the animals in the woods need to thrive and be healthy.
Exactly.
Native bees and native plants, native pollinators and native plants have co-evolved with each other over generations and generations, hundreds and thousands of years. And so we need native plants and native bees, native pollinators together to keep our ecosystems intact. They need each other.
And also there are some things that native bees do that honeybees don't do as well. And one of the things, like our bumblebees, do a better job of pollinating. They pollinate the tomatoes. So if you're getting a tomato, you think the bumblebees, and they're strong, and they also have a system called buzz pollination, which I won't go into explaining. But and there are also native bees in our backyards. We don't even have to go out to the woods. That's why it's important to have in our own yards native plants, and so that those bees that have co-evolved with certain plants, then they get fed. Just like, you know, when we talk about co-evolving, the monarch butterfly has also co-evolved with milkweed, so they need to have that to lay their eggs. Okay.
So we've heard about these massive die-offs of bees all over the world. So what are some of the problems that are facing bees? Why are we getting these massive die-offs of bees and other pollinators?
Well, when we think about the issues facing pollinators, there's really a confluence of different issues that are interacting. So as we've been discussing, pollinators need flowering plants to survive. And as there have been changes on the landscape, changes in our food and farming system, there has been a decline in high-quality pollinator habitat. So there's not enough good food out there for our pollinators. There's also another major factor with the increased use of pesticides. So any insecticide, as you might imagine, will impact an insect like a honeybee or a native bee. And over the past 40 or 50 years, we've seen a significant increase in the use of all pesticides, including insecticides. And there's one class of insecticides in particular that came on the market about 20 years ago called neonicotinoids. And they certainly aren't the only pesticide known to harm pollinators, but they are unique in a few ways that really has been linked with killing off some of our pollinators. So they are very long-lasting in the environment. They're very widely used. They're systemic, meaning they travel throughout the whole plant. And they can travel easily into waterways. And so the widespread use of those pesticides has really impacted the health of all our pollinator communities.
I want to add another thing, that it's, I think it's kind of ironic that with these pollinators that are giving us so much food and so much variety of food and good nutrition, that they themselves are having an issue with starving because they don't have enough to eat. We need to plant plants that they like and in numbers, and instead we've got so many monocultures where they don't get the variety that we get, and we also, I just think it's ironic that that we need to look out for them too, and plant things they like, and think again about some of the monocultures we have. In the old days, in farming, they used to have various kinds of food on their farm, not just all corn or all soybeans or all whatever. And even in our yards, we have all grass instead of flowering plants, whether they're flowering weeds, so-called weeds, or plants that we, invited. So.
And I would add, in addition to pesticides and loss of habitat, there are also parasites and diseases that are impacting especially honeybees, but also other native bees. And when those factors come together, if a bee or a colony is facing a shortage of food and a pesticide exposure and a disease, of course that single organism or the whole colony is going to be impacted when those factors come together.
Right. And one more thing is climate change. Because of climate change, Lex mentioned that some of the plants and bees and other insects co-evolved at the same time. So a plant evolved to be there just at the same time a bee. And if they are not in sync anymore because of climate change, then there's a loss. That has impact.
Now, we've actually seen studies, I think, that show and can measure bee colony loss. Can you talk about that problem and when some of that started?
Certainly. So some of the first reports from commercial beekeepers of losing their honeybee colonies started to come out around 2006. And we have numbers about honeybee losses because they're managed. Just like cattle or any other livestock, there's a beekeeper keeping an eye on how they're doing. Unlike, of course, so many of the native bees that nobody is managing. And so in 2006 or so, beekeepers started to report very significant losses of their colonies. And in the decade or so since then, those losses have fluctuated somewhat, but they have always remained above the level that those beekeepers see as sustainable for their business operations.
But we also have some slides of wild bee reductions too. There's some counties at risk across the country.
Certainly.
We talk about.
Certainly. So when you look at a map of wild bee abundance, and particularly this map is looking at counties where the need for pollination from native bees is high and the abundance of native bees is low. So that means there's a major mismatch between how many native bees are needed for pollination versus how many there actually are present. And if you look at the map of the native bee abundance, what you'll see is that the green areas there are the areas where there is the lowest abundance. And you'll see that it maps pretty closely along the lines of where our major agricultural production is in the United States. And so when you understand, again, the major factors driving pollinator decline, like lack of good and diverse habitat for pollinators to eat from and exposure to pesticides, it makes sense that our heaviest agricultural areas would be the ones where our pollinators are most impacted.
Okay, now you talked about systemic pesticides. Can you tell me, I have heard and I understand that some pesticides don't kill bees outright. They affect their systems. Can you talk about how that process works?
Certainly. So a systemic pesticide is a pesticide that can be applied to the soil, to a seed, or to the plant itself. And instead of just washing off within a few days, it actually is absorbed up into the plant itself. So it's then expressed in the pollen and the nectar and the leaves of the plant, which means that any pollinator who visits that plant is then picking up pesticide along with pollen and nectar. And even if there isn't a high enough concentration to kill a bee or a butterfly outright, there are these low dose, what we call sublethal effects. What that means is that the exposure to the pesticide can impair the pollinator's ability to navigate, to communicate, to collect food effectively, to raise their brood, and it can also impact their immune system and weaken their ability to fight off other issues like diseases and parasites, or to survive a time when they may not have adequate nutrition. And so although we often hear a conversation in the media or from the pesticide industry that says that these pesticides aren't present in the environment at a high enough levels to kill a bee. But the truth is, even if the bee doesn't die outright, what we are seeing is weakened colonies and weakened individual pollinator species so that they can't survive all of the different factors that are coming to impact them.
And you can imagine, too, a bee that is already dealing with something like varroa mites, a parasite, or some other kind of disease, if it's weakened because it doesn't have good nutrition and then gets this low dose of poison, it's a neurotoxin is what it is, that they're in big trouble. What they also found out that with bumblebees, it's affecting the reproduction of the queens. And that's essential to their survival of bumblebees.
So the entire hives are at risk when some of these things happen.
Certainly.
And other insects just flying around. It's my understanding, too, that some of these pesticides, only a small proportion of the pesticide gets into the plant. The rest goes off in the air. It's blown around by the wind. It gets into the water, and it stays in the soil.
Absolutely.
And so I assume other insects are affected in somewhat the same way.
Certainly. One of the most widespread uses of neonicotinoids is as a coating on corn or soybean or other crop seed. And when that seed goes into the ground, research shows us that it's only somewhere between 2 and 20% of the pesticide that gets absorbed up into the plant that it's meant to protect. The rest, as you were saying, washes off into the soil, or at planting time may actually get released into the air. And what you're seeing here is a slide of, this is a jar of corn seed that's been coated with neonicotinoids. And that's the vast majority of corn seed and much of the soybean seed that goes into the ground in the United States. When the pesticide washes off the seed or gets dusted off into the air, it could kill honeybees or native bees outright, or it may just get absorbed into the soil. And then if you think of a dandelion or another or milkweed plant growing up along the edge of that field, it's very likely to pick up some of the pesticide from the soil. And even if honeybees or native bees aren't visiting that corn crop itself, they are likely to visit those plants along the field edges. And so what we're really seeing is a widespread contamination across the landscape.
Okay.
And also, as it goes into the earth or the soil, the earthworms are affected, and other, you know, other creatures that are in the soil itself. So this has a cumulative effect, not only just of the insects, but we're finding a change for bird population and in streams and how they're affected with the water. And so this is really, I mean, it's so serious.
It's a really serious problem.
It is.
Well, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll be talking about what we can do in our yards and communities to solve some of these problems.
Absolutely.
Great.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Kay Erickson with the League of Women Voters of South Tonka, and in this segment of our program, we'll discuss what we as individuals can do to protect pollinators, starting in our own backyards. So what are the things that we can do to make our yards and our communities more pollinator friendly?
We can start by planting native plants. That way they'll feed both honeybees and native bees. And actually right now, lawns are one of our, you know, they're the third largest monocrop in the United States. So we got to take another look at it. They don't feed bees and pollinators. They're a food desert. So if the only time you use your lawn is when you mow it, according to Ron Bowen of Prairie Restorations, you don't need it. So consider replacing your lawn with wonderful flowers. Plant them in, if you must have grass, because maybe you have kids and they would need a play area, keep that area, but also have an area for clover and some other flowering plants within the grass, perhaps. And some things to plant. Plant clean plants. By that I mean systemic-free or pesticide-free. When you go to the nursery to ask for some plants, ask, do they have neonics in them or other systemics? Because if they do, they've made the whole plant, as Lex mentioned earlier, the root, the stem, the leaves, even the pollen and the nectar, poisonous. And if it doesn't kill the bees lethally immediately, which oftentimes it doesn't, it'll get them sublethally eventually. And you don't want that. And so if a nursery or person you're buying the plants from says, gee, I don't know, then go to a different nursery. Or if they say, well, the plants we plant are clean, they're free of neonics, and say, and do all of your suppliers have that same situation? Are they clean of neonics? And if they say, again, well, we can't count on that, then encourage them to find suppliers that can guarantee them that. Because like we like clean food, so do the bees, and so do all the pollinators, the butterflies, the other insects.
Right.
Plant a diversity of plants that bloom spring, summer, fall.
Of course.
We need to eat all that time, so do they. Plant flowers in clumps or masses so that the bees don't have to fly around to wear off their wings. That actually happens. They
get tired.
Some bees have worn out their wings because they're flying and working so hard to get. They stick with one plant. They go to a single, like if they're pollinating apples, they stick with apples and go from plant to plant. And that's how the pollen works, because if they were at an almond tree and they went to an apple tree, it certainly wouldn't help the apple tree get pollinated. Also, I'm encouraging people to live with some leaf damage. When they get plants at a grower that is using organic practices, so what if it has a little leaf damage? That's normal. I mean, the perfect flowering plants and fruit, they're not the normal thing. Tolerate some flowering weeds in your yard and in your garden.
Like what would those be?
Well, like actually dandelions are good for honeybees, and there are ice-eating bumblebees on them. And what happens is they provide pollen, and the pollen is a source of protein. And actually, Creeping Charlie is a form of, has nectar. However, when you have these plants, it's important to keep them out of your neighbor's yard. So I kind of make sure they're, when we're at the boundaries, I pull it back from there.
Okay.
And another thing is use IPM practices, integrated pest management. And basically what that means is you use chemicals as a last, totally last resort, only if it's really, really needed. And if they're taking over your plants, but if you see, you know, a few insects that are eating your plants, So what? If they're all taking over and you need that for money that you're making to live on, then consider using chemicals. Yep. So I'd say stop using those pesticides, insecticides, and fungicides, you know, and use leaf mulch and organic compost. Ask organic gardeners how they do it. Yeah. You know, find out from them. Get a neighborhood kid to hand weed your lawn or spot spray it where it's needed, you know, that kind of thing. And then start learning about native plants and how they grow. And yeah. So those are some things you might want to add something in.
So we've got many ways to manage our yards, but we can also work to change policies and practices that are harmful to pollinators. One of the ways both of you are working to educate the public and our elected officials is by publicizing a film called the Keep the Hives Alive Tour. This film follows James Cook, who's a young commercial beekeeper, as he drives his truck with 2.5 million bees across the country in 2006 to raise awareness about bee die-off and how serious an issue this really is. The short clip of the film we're going to play now is about local action, and it features Patricia and shows how Humming for Bees, her local organization, was able to work with the city of Shorewood to change some of the city's land management practices to help pollinators.
People are starting to advocate for bees on a local level, and with great success. James learned of one example of successful local action when he visited Montevideo in his home state of Minnesota. He saw how one grassroots group, Humming for Bees, had success when they went to the town of Shorewood and asked Councilwoman Christine Sunberg to help them ban bee-killing chemicals in their community.
I was well aware of the issues, you know, with the bee population demise and how that impacts our food chain, our economic system, etc. It didn't dawn on me that we as a city could be a part of that solution until Patricia and all of the others came to us. And really what they did were two things. Sounds simple, but it wasn't. But educate us and then offer a solution. And it was a really easy solution. It wasn't tough. It didn't cost a lot of money that we'd have people come pounding on our doors about, you know, that sort of thing. But it was a start. It get that momentum going.
Ultimately, because of the grassroots work of a few people in local communities, the entire state of Minnesota passed legislation to limit the use of systemic bee-killing chemicals.
On our website, if people are interested in learning about what they can do, they can go to our website, click on resources, and then find how we did it, find other cities, and they can also find a model pollinator resolution. And along with that is a sheet that we encourage them, a two-sided sheet called the Task Force on Systemic Pesticides. That was a group of scientists from around the globe who did an independent study for a number of years and then published their results. And they are talking about neonics and fipronil, two systemics, and they're asking for a global alert. And it is important that we, you know, make a difference in our cities, ask them to start paying attention and educating the citizenry and being careful about what they plant. And also, it'll make a difference if the more cities in Minnesota that do that, the sooner that the state can become more pollinator safe. Not just, we need to be pollinator safe.
So you've got directions for how other cities might do this. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that Shorewood did after the resolution was passed?
We planted some clover. The communications person, Julie, and she's got these available to other cities if they want, on a regular basis, inserted into the newsletter just different information about pollinators and what people could do and what the city was doing. And they made sure plants that they sold through the city were clean plants. They were pesticide free. And I know, Lex, you've done a lot of work at the state and on the governor's commission and everything. You've got things people can do.
Absolutely.
Great, let's talk about that. What would you like to see people do?
Sure.
And how can they do practical things that they can do themselves?
Absolutely. Well, first I want to shout out the example that we have from Shorewood and from Humming for Bees. I think starting at the local level is always one of the most powerful things we can do. So here in Minnesota, after Shorewood's example, as the first local community to pass one of these, there are now, I think, something like 25 or 30 local communities that have done that. And as far as I know, that's more than any other state in the country. So I would really encourage folks to work with your local community to pass a resolution like that. And the next thing I would say is get involved in the policy process at the state level. We really need putting the pressure on individuals in their own backyards and on their own farms really lets our policymakers and our decision makers off the hook, because to really make a true transition from an agricultural system that does rely heavily on pesticides, we need policy solutions. Individual farmers are making the best choices that they can in a food system that's very broken. And so what we need is policy fixes that offer supports for farmers to reduce their use of pollinator-harming pesticides. Oh. So I'm really honored to get to serve on Governor Dayton's Committee on Pollinator Protection. There are 15 of us who are advising the governor and his state agencies on state policy regarding pollinators. Please send us your ideas, your thoughts, what you think that we should do as a committee, because we really should be responsible and accountable to the folks that we are representing in the state. And I would also encourage folks to get in touch with your legislators. All of us are represented by somebody at the state level here in Minnesota, and invite your legislator, especially during the summer and fall when they're not up at the Capitol, to come out and see your pollinator-friendly garden. Let them know you're concerned about these issues, and let them know that you support policies to reduce the use of pesticides that harm pollinators and to transition our food system into one that really sustains the critical honeybees, monarchs, native pollinators that we need to grow healthy food.
Do you want to talk a little bit about your organization, Patricia, about Humming for Bees?
I guess I'd just like to say that we've got a lot of information on our website. We're happy to take calls and support people who want to make changes. We've got that model resolution, and we encourage people. We even have a little sheet we can tell them about how to get in touch with their representatives. And you know, we all learned about politics way back in high school, and then we get off in our busy lives and forget some of the things we've learned. And it's not so hard, even just picking up the phone to call and say, I care about pollinators, please do everything you can to protect them. This is such a critical issue. I mean, when we talk about our food supply and food security, we need them. And so that's what our organization is about, and we're encouraging people to you don't have to be anyone special. You can just be who you are and do the best that you can do, and it makes a difference. Just even calling the governor and saying thank you for having a pollinator committee.
Exactly.
Calling and supporting those legislatures. And there's another thing. Please ask them to, we've asked them on our website to say, support Saving America's Pollinators. They can also call Washington, D.C., the House of Representatives. This is the third time they've put forth a bill called Supporting Saving America's Pollinators. It's Act of 2017. They started it in 2013. It went for 2 years. Then they had to renew it in 2015. This is the third time they've renewed it. We don't have enough people. Why can't Minnesota be the group that, you know, gets all their representatives on board with this? So they should call there. It's HR 3040. That means House of Representatives Bill 3040. And support our pollinators. Let's get active. Yeah.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you, Lex, for being here today. And thank you for the work you're doing to protect pollinators and to let us know what all of us can do to help. League of Women Voters of South Tonka serves the cities of Deep Haven, Excelsior Greenwood, Tonka Bay, Shorewood, and Woodland. We welcome both men and women in the organization, and we invite you to join us. The League of Women Voters is nonpartisan, so we don't support or oppose parties or candidates, but we do study issues. We take positions and lobby at the local, state, and national levels. For more about what we do in the South Lake area, you can go to our website, lwvsouthtonka.org. To find out more information about bees and how to protect them, you can go to the State League website about bees. That website is lwvmnbees.org, and it takes you directly to our publications about bees and lots of other information. You can see the entire Keep the Hives Alive tour at their website, which is keephivesalive.org. And the full version of that show will be played on this channel. Just look at the website for information about times. It's lmcctv.org. Dr. Marla Spivak has a free online TED Talk titled Why Bees Are Disappearing. That's a wonderful resource as well. There's a coming event called Pollination Fest on September 10th in Stillwater, put on by the Pollinator Friendly Alliance. You can find out information about that at pollinatorfriendly.org. Finally, I'd like to thank the Lake Minnetonka Communications Commission for the opportunity to present this program, and thank you for watching.